I understood on another level that President Tsai herself was going through a backlash from China. There were people in the People's Liberation Army in Beijing leaked memos about them saying, someone who wears a skirt cannot be in charge of the military. Someone who isn't married and hasn't had children isn't emotionally stable and can't think long term. They said terrible things. They tried to call her a bad descendant of the Chinese people.
You're listening to Talking Taiwan with your host, Felicia Lin.
Vanessa Hopes is the director of Invisible Nation, a documentary film that takes a look at the presidency of Tsai Ing Wen, Taiwan's first female president, and events that happened during her tenure. We talked about what first brought Vanessa to Taiwan, which meant that she was there in 1996 during the inauguration of Lee Teng-hui, Taiwan's first directly elected president. And then, in 2016, after Vanessa came to Taiwan with an international delegation to observe Taiwan's presidential elections and witnessed the election of Tsai Ing-wen, she came up with the idea for a film about Tsai Ing-wen's presidency. Vanessa's first feature-length documentary, All Eyes and Ears, examined relations between the U.S. and China through the stories of U.S. Ambassador to China John Huntsman, his adopted Chinese daughter Gracie May, and blind legal advocate Chen Guangcheng. When I asked Vanessa about her experiences making a documentary film in China, she recounted a story that explained why she personally related to the backlash and pressure from China that Chou Zhu-yu, a Taiwanese member of a K-pop band, has faced. We also talked about some of the challenges in making Invisible Nation over a 7-year period, Vanessa's personal motivations for making the film, and where Invisible Nation is going to be screened in the near future. Here's our interview. Welcome to the podcast, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Felicia. I'm really excited to be here.
So let's start from the very beginning, of course. I'm sure you've told the story like 100 times. But what brought you to Taiwan in the first place, and how did you get interested in Taiwan?
What brought me to Taiwan in the first place was a study abroad program, the year 1995 to 96. And it turned out to be the year when Taiwan held their first direct presidential elections. And China was firing missiles at us on the island of Taiwan. And it was scary. And I was concerned and curious and talking to my journalist friends and trying to understand. And Chinese language teacher I had that year had just bought a camera and said, "Why don't you borrow my camera and go film?" And so the weekend I went to film was President Lee Teng-hui's inauguration weekend. And I made a little short film afterward and shared it when I went to work at the Council on Foreign Relations, a think tank in New York City, because that year in Taiwan changed my life. It kind of made me wake up and realize this was something I wanted to study and better understand, especially what were the U.S. foreign policy fingerprints on this story. Why did the U.S. send 2 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait? And I managed 20 years later to use that footage in the feature documentary Invisible Nation that we're talking about now.
I'm curious, was that the first time that you dabbled in film?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
It was the first time I dabbled in film, and that's a long story. If you really want the full generational story, I recorded and wrote a podcast called Love is a Crime. That is the first joint venture podcast Vanity Fair did. And you can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. And it tells the story of my mother's parents, who were an actress, Joan Bennett, and a film producer, Walter Wanger, in Hollywood. And their experiences while making my mother have a deep love of film also turned her off from the business. So she was very concerned about her children going into the business of film. She was very excited when I was studying Chinese and going into a PhD program, and she thought I was just going to become an academic.
She's like, oh, she's safe. She's not going in that direction.
Exactly. Because, I mean, it's true today, unfortunately, especially in independent film. It's just a roller coaster ride financially, economically, the business of film, especially for stories that are investigating truth or daring to look at politics, are not easy for the major distributors to buy right now. Apparently, they've decided to focus on what they consider to be bigger box office material.
Yeah, and I mean, the film industry just is not the same. I mean, even around here in New York, that you see so many theaters have closed or are struggling and so forth. It's just not the same.
Yeah, that's so sad. It's true. And if you're very interested in that subject, my husband is writing on it daily on his Substack, which is called Hope for Film. That's Ted Hope, who is always looking for solutions and ways to reinvigorate and improve the film industry. So my mother couldn't complain about me being in film once she met Ted and knew I was going to be with him.
That's great.
Yeah.
So then how did you come up with the idea for the film Invisible Nation specifically?
So I had lived in China first, in Beijing, and I had mentors from the Council on Foreign Relations, Elizabeth Economy, but also a man named Jerome Allen Cohen, who just goes by Jerry Cohen. And he had brought me into the U.S. ambassador to China's residence under President Bush. And I thought that this was an interesting window into that world that we don't normally have access to, and that we could better understand the relations between the countries. I'm very interested in international relations and diplomacy and how it works. And I made a film on the U.S.-China relationship following President Obama's first U.S. ambassador to China, John Huntsman. And when I finished that film, which came out around 2015, 2016, I was tracking developments in Taiwan. I had been back to Taiwan since 1995, 96. And even when I was at the Council on Foreign Relations, I was so, curious about Taiwan and focused on it. I had written an op-ed about missile defense, and at that time argued that Taiwan didn't need missile defense because China was going to become a friendly neighbor. It's 2016, early January, and I hear about an international delegation that's traveling to Taipei to monitor that the elections are free and fair. And I join so that I can be there to see what I think may be a historic election, that Taiwan might elect their first female president. And I was there with a film crew, and it happened. And I've never been in an audience quite so ecstatic and quite so exciting as the one who witnessed President Tsai's win. And the screen behind her on the stage was blaring, "We are Taiwanese." And I realized this was a huge story that I wanted to learn and didn't fully understand. And it was so thrilling that this was a first female president of a democratic progressive party, meaning a feminist woman, not someone like we've seen in power who is conservative. And that matters because it's not just a question of women in power. It's how is this woman leading? What does that look like? It's so rare still in the world to have a first female president. So I did an application for a grant that focused on women, peace, and security, and managed to get that by the end of 2016. And then at the same time, was put in contact with a producer in Taipei named Sylvia Feng. So we learned we needed to submit a proposal to the president's office in Taipei, which Sylvia helped us deliver. And then they told us, wait 6 months. And 6 months later, which is basically standard for them, they said, why don't you see if you can get a first meeting with President Tsai by coming to Taipei and filming other interviews? And then that's what happened in April 2017. We filmed with Chunju first, actually. And eventually we had this meeting, and it was a long table. I remember President Tsai's team was there. My little team was there. And they'd already reviewed our proposal, and we were just further discussing it. And President Tsai left the room first. As she headed to the door, she turned back and nodded in agreement that we had the green light, and then closed the door behind her quickly. And we burst into excitement. And then they basically said, come back in 2 weeks. And that was May 2017. And we had 5 weeks filming, was our first trip.
What were you envisioning for the film initially? Was it much different from what we see the film in its present form? Were you thinking more to focus on the idea that this is the first female president, that sort of angle? Like, did it change?
Yes, as I mentioned, really excited by this idea of a first female president. And I found it pretty shocking, the lack of support and interest for that subject. And I understood on another level that President Tsai herself was going through a backlash from China. There were people in the People's Liberation Army in Beijing leaked memos about them saying, you know, someone who wears a skirt cannot be in charge of the military. Someone who isn't married and hasn't had children isn't emotionally stable and can't think long term. They said terrible things. They tried to call her a bad descendant of the Chinese people. All of this, none of which we wanted in the film, because I believed in giving President Tsai dignity and respect. And you could see it as a metaphor for what Taiwan faces in terms of discrimination on the world stage from international organizations like the United Nations, civil aviation, and beyond, and corporations and diplomatic allies. China's always poaching Taiwan's diplomatic allies. So Taiwan faces this kind of discrimination, and that started to become the story. We knew that it wasn't going to be easy to manage a first female president storyline in the film. And in fact, President Tsai is not a diva, as you can tell. She's sort of the opposite of the person with an orange face who we ended up with here as president in 2016 in the United States. That was a disaster. They could not have been more different. And President Tsai's modest, quiet, humble leadership was very inspiring. And I think ultimately we found a way to incorporate her, but not being a diva and not wanting the spotlight on herself alone. She wanted to highlight her team and highlight Taiwan's story and how Taiwan achieved the incredible democracy it has, which is a story we just don't know, partly because China doesn't want people to know that there is such a thing as a successful Chinese-speaking democracy, because it means they might have democracy in China, and it's not true that Chinese people don't like or can't handle democracy. All kinds of things are said by the Chinese Communist Party to prevent democracy happening there. But Taiwan is the shining example of a successful democracy that's stronger than the one we have in the United States, that's been making progress while we've been backsliding in the United States. So all of that started to come into focus. And then what happens when you're making documentary is you may think maybe this film will be finished in 3 years and that will be the end of it. But because we had access to Taiwan's first female president, Tsai Ing Wen, and she decided to run again in 2020, we then realized that we were making this film over her 2 terms. That was going to be the length of the film. And that was frankly important because of the major global developments, from the peaceful protests in Hong Kong, which China cracked down on, making the one country, two systems deal look terrible, untenable for Taiwan, from COVID happening and Taiwan not being in the World Health Organization and excluded when it has so much to contribute and so much, not only an advanced healthcare system, one of the best in the world, but deep knowledge of how to deal with these diseases coming from China, beginning with SARS and before that. that is something that they should be contributing to the world. The world could be learning from Taiwan, and that makes it all the worse that they're excluded. And then it was, unfortunately, Russia's invasion of Ukraine that really woke people up to the importance of the story of Taiwan because of the closeness of Putin and Xi Jinping and the way in which you can't trust a dictator because they do what they want when they want to, and threats that Xi Jinping was making in terms of not renouncing the use of force against Taiwan in his first speech to Taiwan in 40 years, which happened in 2019, to an increasingly aggressive, violent use of language about his intentions toward Taiwan. So all of this happened during these two terms, and I think increased the urgency, the stakes of the story, and the importance of it to international audiences who we've always been hoping to reach in ways that no one had been paying attention to Taiwan before, no matter what I was trying to do or say. And now it's come out, it feels like, at the right time, because many countries in the world are voting in their democracies this year. And in the United States, it feels like democracy is really at stake, on the line, come November.
Right. It's so interesting, as you just mentioned, all the things that happened over the course of filming this documentary. And I thought it'd be interesting to think about how the visibility or the coverage of Taiwan has changed over the course of the film. What was it like when you first started working on this film? And do you think it's changed over these 7-8 years?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, which I feel a little bit close to and maybe more in the weeds than people who are on the outside of the story. So I'm not sure if my perspective will be as helpful, but I know when it comes to filming with President Tsai, for example, that she felt the need to become more accessible and warm and open on camera. And then really in her second term, I think her team made a conscious decision that they didn't want the international media covering her too closely. And she wasn't giving as much access to the media, not even locally in Taiwan. They sort of wanted her to become invisible in a way. And some people argue that that paid off. That may have helped with the unprecedented win of the Democratic Progressive Party with a third term this January, with President Tsai's Vice President William Lai Ching-te becoming president-elect, and her de facto ambassador to the United States, Xiaobi Kim, becoming vice president-elect. But I do think that, especially on the heels of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think there's been much more media attention and coverage of Taiwan, of the importance of Taiwan's story, and sort of a slight loosening of the way in which Taiwan is referred to. That more news outlets use the word country, less of that old Chinese Communist Party line about Taiwan being a rogue province, which you were reading all the time before. And, I think that in the Congress, they've passed some bills that have been, or some acts, I should say, they've passed different updates kind of on the Taiwan Relations Act in a way, different ways to strengthen the U.S.-Taiwan relationship on the margins without offending China. And there is increasing desire to do more for Taiwan, as long as that is in Taiwan's interest, to Taiwan's benefit, and following the wishes of the people of Taiwan and what they are asking for, I would say.
I'm also wondering about the name of the film. How did you come up with that name? Can you tell me a little bit about the background for that?
Yeah, I am so happy that is the name, because it feels meaningful at this moment in time with what's happening in Israel and Gaza and Ukraine. But specifically for Taiwan, it really came about organically because I was shocked. I mean, I thought I knew some of Taiwan's story, but the extent to which Taiwan is made invisible by China's controlling the narrative about Taiwan and keeping them out of, as we were saying, international organizations, the United Nations, the World Health Assembly, and corporations afraid to put Taiwan as a country in a drop-down menu from, all of that.
The
It's
Olympics.
just the Olympics. We could go on, and we have that in the film. And really, people don't know this history. It reminds me a little of how when I produced a film by the daughters of a civil rights lawyer named William Kunstler, their names are Emily and Sarah Kunstler, that is called Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. And that film is telling history in America that most people just don't know. It's a history that's been repressed. It's one we don't really want to look at. And so, there's always some pushback when you're telling a current events story, a documentary that's following a timeline that's unfolding in ways you can't know, and you have to have some history in there. But this history is not history that anyone really knows. And they still come up to me after screenings, people in the audience, and say, wow, even if they're Taiwanese, often they don't necessarily know it all. So it's been meaningful.
I'm also wondering, did President Tsai have any say at all in the direction of the film, or what would be allowed to be included in the film?
She did not, and I don't actually have direct contact with President Tsai. I've only ever had contact through people in her office, and they don't have final cut of the movie. So I did my best to communicate, but I wasn't being controlled.
What would you say is your personal motivation for making this film? Because I have to say, this is not my opinion, but when I was at the Taiwan Center in New York, I talked to some people who watched the film afterwards. And of course, there will always be some people that are like, well, what's the agenda? What's the agenda of this filmmaker? Why did she make the film? There's a lot of questions, people who don't know your story. What would you say to that?
I like the way you put it, personal motivation, because I did actually feel an emotional connection to the story as we were making it, where I think that the treatment and status of Taiwan is very similar to the treatment and status of women globally. We're still second-class citizens. We're still largely unseen, unheard, underrepresented, not in power at decision-making tables. And all of that is an emotional pull where I was motivated by the fact that these women in Taiwan in positions of power were showing such tremendous resilience in the face of discrimination and backlash. And they were making progress and doing transitional justice in the face of repression and authoritarian forces that would rather silence and sideline and marginalize women and minorities. And that was incredibly inspiring. But if I really dig deep, I would say that I felt guilty, frankly, as an American coming to this Taiwan story at this level of depth and understanding so late, that I had lived in Taiwan 95, 96. I was at the Council on Foreign Relations working to understand it when everything was focused on engagement with China and no one was talking about Taiwan's story. And I'm sad about that. I regret that. I feel I came to the story late. And I feel it's a clear indication of where U.S. foreign policy needs to be held accountable, that we don't hold the figures in power in foreign policy in the United States accountable, that it's not a democratic part of the government. And I think that's frustrating students on campuses across the country right now. And you don't want to feel helpless and powerless. And film is a way to give voice to people who deserve to be heard and help encourage new thinking and conversations and positive change. That's how I was looking at it.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned earlier that one of the first people that you filmed was Chenju, because to me, that was really one of the most touching scenes in the film. I actually met her when I was in high school because she visited Canada where I grew up.
Wow.
Yeah, it was just very touching to see that she walked through the prison that she spent 7 years in. In the film, she said it was the first time that she had visited.
Yeah.
So how did that come about in that scene and meeting her?
That really came about thanks to our producer, Sylvia Fung. But another advisor to the film who was maybe more concerned about bridging the divide between those who lean green toward the Democratic Progressive Party and those who lean blue toward the KMT, Chinese Nationalist Party, feel equally comfortable embracing Chen Chu. I think it's an uncomfortable history of Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalist military dictatorship on Taiwan, the suppression of so many people for 38 years. It's not something people who are in the KMT today really want to examine, but something that people who are in the DPP, the first native political party in Taiwan, feel needs to be examined. That history for truth and justice and reconciliation and forgiveness. And I think that it's incredible how Chen Chu and President Tsai Ing Wen speak to this and in the film. But I think Chen Chu was also really a mentor to President Tsai and paved the way for her. And at one point we had more of her in different cuts of the film because President Tsai brought her into her administration. And that was beautiful. But it was a way to look at that history through a character who had a real emotional connection to it and could share how meaningful it was for her to really fight for democracy and human rights and then be willing to die for them. I mean, I think that level of sacrifice, Chen Chu didn't know she was going to get out of prison. So she wrote her will while there and dedicated her life to the people of Taiwan. And I think regardless of your party, you cannot but be moved by that. So we were all moved by her and her story and her wisdom. And we knew she was critical to the film. And I hope to be able to share additional material, like short form material we filmed with her, because there's a lot more than could fit in 85 minutes.
And you interviewed President Tsai's predecessor, President Ma Ying-jeou, right?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on him? What was it like meeting him?
It was very interesting meeting him because that mentor I mentioned from the Council on Foreign Relations,
yes,
Jerome Allen Cohen, Jerry Cohen, had been a professor at Harvard Law School to both Ma Ying-jeou, who obviously went back to Taiwan and eventually became president, and Liu Xiaolian, Annette Liu.
Yes.
So, and they were in the same class at Harvard.
Yes, Annette, who later became the vice president. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Vice President Annette Liu with the first Democratic Progressive President Chen Shui-bian. I have actually some additional material to put out in short form about Annette Liu because I think she's really fascinating. But I had heard tons of stories about Ma Ying-jeou from Jerry Cohen.
Certainly.
Yeah. And then I was happy to share those stories with him, actually. That made him feel warm toward me. He knew, actually.
You mean you shared those stories with Ma Ying-jeou that Jerry had told you?
Exactly. And in particular, Jerry had mentioned that he had called on Ma Ying-jeou to try and help get Annette Liu out of prison because she shared the same prison cell with Chen Chu. And it was really a case of they had both been at Harvard, Annette Liu and Ma Ying-jeou. And when they went back to Taiwan, one became president and one was thrown in jail. I mean, not exactly in that timing and order, but it's pretty dramatic. So I knew many people in Taiwan, too, who, again, it's that generational change. The younger generation was leaning green, but their parents had leaned blue and really either had a crush on Ma Ying-jeou or really liked him. So he felt like an important story. Also, a lot of good happened in the relations between Taiwan and China when he was president. And then also some negative that the young people of Taiwan especially seemed to fight back against with the Sunflower Movement. And all of that was kind of how President Tsai came to power. So it was sort of to understand how she finally got elected because she lost to him in 2012. That was something I learned early on and was really wondering if I could ever get in the edit. And we couldn't until I moved to Taiwan for the edit in July 2022 through February 2023 when we were still filming. And the local editors, who all use pseudonyms because they also work with Chinese directors and don't want to harm those projects, they brought their local knowledge and understanding, and we figured out how to fit it all in. But I think, again, it shows you that democracy does work. You can come out of an authoritarian dictatorship and transition peacefully to a democracy. There is always, transitional justice to do, but Taiwan is leading the way on all of that. And it's just such an important story for all countries to learn. We all have authoritarian tending parties in our democracies even. And unfortunately, there's a big right-wing authoritarian turn happening globally right now. And it's more important than ever to understand and strengthen democracy. Learn from Taiwan.
And now for a short break. We've got some exciting news. We just learned that Talking Taiwan has been chosen as a finalist out of 700 entries from 33 countries in the Moment of Visionary Leadership category for the 2024 International Women's Podcast Awards. No matter what the final results of the award show on June 19th reveal, it's been tremendously gratifying to have our work recognized. We're currently working on bringing Talking Taiwan to the 53rd Annual Taiwanese American Conference that will be held at Westchester University in Pennsylvania, July 3rd to 7th. This year's impressive list of conference speakers include Taiwan's former Vice President, Dr. Chen Chien-jen, and Freddie Lim, activist, politician, and lead singer of the heavy metal band Chictonic. We will be creating an on-location podcasting studio where we will interview several of the speakers at TAC and editing them into episodes of Talking Taiwan. We'll also be interviewing past TAC organizers for a special episode of Talking Taiwan about the history and legacy of TAC. And finally, while we're at TAC, we will create a 5-minute video montage to capture the moments throughout the conference that will be shown at the closing ceremony of the conference. To support the work that Talking Taiwan will be doing at TAC, you can make a contribution to our GoFundMe campaign, or through PayPal or Zelle using our email address talkingtaiwanpodcast@gmail.com. For more details on how to donate, visit talkingtaiwan.com/support. Our current fundraising goal is $3,000. It's thanks to listeners like you that make what we do possible. Now, back to the episode. Yeah, you mentioned that you also worked at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm wondering, can you talk about how that shaped your thoughts on Taiwan, or maybe actually, I think I read one of your interviews actually was probably the opposite, because actually when in your time there, people were not encouraged to talk about Taiwan, right? The focus is actually probably more so on China.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, though, what was helpful, what I learned working there was how to understand foreign policy and international relations and the way the world was working, and feel comfortable exploring those topics in that world that women are actually excluded from to a large extent, not always overtly. I mean, it's just a fact that we haven't been in that field for long. And that's why there is such a thing as this women, peace, and security rubric. You have to remind people that women exist. You have to remind them that women matter to peace and security. When they're part of peace negotiations, that peace will last longer. It will be better. When thinking about security, the world could do better if it had a sense of equality for women. So all of that kind of thinking came out of having worked there. The comfort, maybe a little bit of confidence that I could get into this subject, which I think is extremely intimidating for most people. Or, as again, the student protests are showing, very frustrating. People feel helpless. We know the United States is not isolated on the world stage any more than any other country. We're all in a global conversation and we're all living in a globalized world. But how can we better understand it and our place in it and what we can and should do to make it better versus having, the US foreign policy led by a military agenda or something like that. I think there's a thinker I really like whose name is Van Jackson, who has a new book called Grand Strategies of the Left, the Foreign Policy of Progressive World Making, that I highly recommend, especially to anyone who's out there protesting right now. It just feels like a really important way to think about what you would like the United States to prioritize in foreign policy. If it were prioritizing democracy, equality, and peace, this is what the world would look like. And then the reasons why we don't. What are those obstacles? So it's a world, too, that I felt like, in that world, while China was being prioritized, I still knew Taiwan mattered. What I was told was Taiwan is a flashpoint for World War III. We don't want to aggravate that. That's why we're not talking about it. But I don't know that that was the best way to go about it, frankly. And now that I've really lived in Taiwan and listened to the people of Taiwan and heard what they're saying, it's clear that they've been wanting to be better heard and understood for decades, and that not right that they weren't. So to be able to make a film and take this story out of that little foreign policy world and into a wider international world and conversation also was motivating me the whole time and felt really important.
There were a lot of historical facts, media, news clips, and a lot of things included in this film to come together to help the audience to understand the situation. And I just can't imagine, you must have had a tremendous team working with you to make sure that you're getting all of these facts and history and the story right. Can you talk about who was on your team, like the types of individuals and how they helped put things together, and check for the factual accuracy?
Yeah. So it's funny when I watch the movie because I can think through where each moment and choice came from. And that's probably a 10 episode podcast or something, if anyone really wants to know. So I would try to narrow this down for you and say, one of the funny things is one of my professors, Andy Nathan from Columbia University, is in the film a lot. I've interviewed him a lot about the facts of the history and the questions of democratization. I think he's terrific on that. When I was in Taipei in January 2016 and the lead up to President Tsai's election win, that Cho Zu-yu story broke. And it was so fascinating to me. And the way in which this young Taiwanese woman in a Korean pop band got dragged through the mud for waving a little Taiwanese flag in a video by people in China claiming she wasn't properly respecting the One China principle that they hold, that Taiwan is part of China and therefore don't show that flag. And now you better make a confession and say you believe that Taiwan is part of China. All of that really resonated with me, actually, for reasons of an experience I had in particular on making the first film, which is a long story. But let's just say I knew that story of Cho Zu-yu mattered, and the way President Tsai spoke up for her was important and possibly helpful in her election win, and is something that, as Wen Liu says in the film, she's someone I met. I really got into the Taiwanese community in that last year I was living there. So Wen Liu says, actually something she says, which is not on camera in the film, is that in her life, really the only president she's known is President Tsai, but that President Tsai is the first president to really use the word Taiwan in international conversations and context, that she really stood up for Taiwan's sovereignty and identity in this way that hadn't been done before. And there's this phenomenon right now, again, where even 5 years ago, it was unthinkable to come out with all of these stories of Taiwan. But now our movie is part of this new wave of books and movies about Taiwan that kind of show you how much their sense of identity grew out of democratization, that kind of self-determination. And Taiwan's story deserves to be heard. It's high time to get it out there. So, and then again, it was the local edit team and producing team led by Sylvia Fung in Taiwan. They were definitely helping us make sure we were crossing every T and dotting every I. And we were testing in feedback screenings in the community in Taipei because one of our editors had a great screening room, and having all these conversations to shape the story in a way that people could really grasp it. But it did feel to me like focusing on women leaders in Taiwan, women politicians, was going to help get across this sense of discrimination that Taiwan faces as a country, that these women face, that they are overcoming.
I know that there's a lot of historical facts and things that you need to explain and include in the film, but I did notice that there were some things that were left out. Like, if I want to be really picky about it, I noticed that when Chiang Ching-kuo was mentioned and his part in the democratization of Taiwan, that the attempt to assassinate him was left out. And so I'm wondering, how do you decide what historical facts to include or omit in the film? Like, how did you go about that?
You're really going deep. You're going deep. This is great. This is a great question. No. We really, really did have to think about this and it was it was like doing a PhD or something. It was like once I had done all the research and all the interviews and had all the material and had really digested it, then we continued to edit it down and edit it down and edit it down and test it on audiences. And what we found was, if I had just given you a play-by-play linear history of the facts of Taiwan from the beginning, audiences started to feel like that was a history documentary.
Sure.
And if I put too much President Tsai forward in the first act, then they were thinking they were getting a biopic about President Tsai. So the balance of that was tricky. And beyond that, really critical seemed to be the emotional responses of people who either leaned green or leaned blue, or were pro-United States or against the United States. That negotiation was very delicate. So frankly, what came up very interestingly in cutting the movie down to 1 hour for television, which I literally just completed today. I was in there this morning finishing that.
Thank you for making time for this interview.
Of course. I know I have to pack to fly to DC tomorrow for a conference about Taiwan and the United Nations and Resolution 2758. So in order to do this cut down for television of our movie, which is 85 minutes and had to get down to 55 minutes. So it already seems short, but now we have to we take 30 minutes out of it, which is a lot. We got a fresh pair of eyes, this Canadian story editor who reviewed the film and the transcript and made suggestions. And this was a fascinating process because he's smart. He had been a journalist and he understood every moment in the movie. And he commended it for clarity and ability to condense so much in a short period of time. But what we negotiated with him when we were discussing his idea of cutting down, because you mentioned Jiang Jingguo, he left in that Jiang Jingguo lifted martial law. And I remember in the movie around that point, Andy Nathan from Columbia, my professor, says something like, at that point, the KMT, Chinese Nationalist Party, knew that they couldn't remain an authoritarian dictatorship basically without U.S. support. And they didn't have the support of the people of Taiwan unless they did this process of Taiwanization. So we sort of sneak two things in there that are very important in Taiwan's history, but also the fact that the U.S. was supporting the military dictatorship. We get that in a slightly soft-pedaled way because there's a lot of debate about was that a good or bad thing, believe it or not, regardless of what my opinion might be. So this story editor had thought it would save time if we then cut out Chen Ju and the woman who was Minister of Culture, Chen Li-jun, who tell you in 2 sound bites how the grassroots bottom-up democratization movement happened just in that moment. We circled back to it at the end of the film, but they're basically like, the environmental movement, the women's movement, the democracy movement, the human rights movement, all of these movements, they were in the streets, they were coming together, and they were pushing the KMT to amend the Constitution and move toward democracy. And so that was something absolutely critical and non-negotiable in a cut down of this movie. You can't just cut out the grassroots, bottom-up people power that motivated democratization, which if you ask anyone who leans green, they'll be like, we would never have democracy if that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And, the people who lean blue might be like, oh, yeah, we gave democracy to the people of Taiwan because Jiang Jingguo said, okay, fine. No, that's not the whole story. So to know what the really critical beats are and then stand by them, that was a lot of the art of this movie. And of course, many people were cross-checking it and debating it, but that was what was the delicate dance. And that is why, for example, Chen Chu's big moment in the movie where she walks us through the prison, as you said, comes later. We plant a seed. We plant many seeds at the beginning of the movie and we grow them, develop them later because we found we were turning off audiences who either lean green or lean blue if we went too heavily one way or the other way, or including on the US side, and that was the art of it. We circled back to the seeds that we plant in the beginning because you can't give people too much up front. It pushes them one way or the other and then they're out of it. To draw them in, you have to just give breadcrumbs initially and then go deeper.
Yeah, so tell me about these test audiences. How do you decide what is the demographic of the test audience? Because that presumes that is the audience that this film is aimed at too. So I'm asking two questions in one. I'm wondering, what was the demographic of the test audience? And then what was the audience that this film is geared towards?
Well, the audience that the film is geared towards is the widest possible audience we can reach. I mean, everyone from the side who cannot or did not know there was a difference between Taiwan and Thailand, that terrible joke that lingers because it still applies because there is that side of the spectrum, all the way to the most sophisticated audience members who have studied and lived in Taiwan or are Taiwanese and speak and know tons, but will still think, wow, this is so fascinating and current. It's got access to people I don't normally have access, or showing me sides of them I wouldn't normally see, just as an American looking at a movie about American history, where I can say that all the time with these documentaries that come out. So our test audiences were as kind of diverse as we could make them. And there is quite an international expat scene in Taipei that we tapped into, but we also wanted, again, that same people who lean green, people who lean blue. We had them all in the test audience screenings, and people who are American, pro all of American foreign policy, and people willing to criticize it and know what's worked and hasn't.
I read in one of your interviews, and you alluded to earlier, that some of your Taiwanese edit team, or I'm sure that some of the Taiwanese that worked on your film, they may have had to use pseudonyms. Perhaps they work on films that have some kind of connection to China and so forth. Can you tell me why that's necessary?
Yes, absolutely. So there's one American editor whose name is in the credits for the editors, Dave Henry, who's here in Los Angeles. And then he did a first pass on the movie, but then I went to Taiwan and lived there and worked with a local team who, all three of them are using pseudonyms. All three of them are a team who work really mostly on films by Chinese directors. And those films would be jeopardized were the authorities in China to find out that their names were on a film about Taiwan that was telling a history that was truthful of Taiwan. Even just, ever since I've studied China, I've known that China has these 3 T's that you're not supposed to talk about: Taiwan, Tiananmen, and Tibet. And these kinds of rules are what prevent people from learning the truth and telling Taiwan's story and making a difference. And it's what causes people to self-censor. It's that anaconda in the chandelier effect that Perry Link has written about, where, the Chinese Communist Party is up here and you never know where their red lines are when they're going to try to pounce on you and stop you. So because you're afraid, you censor yourself. And I think that the fear is warranted, but in particular, these editors who were in Taiwan were worried about the dangers that would happen to the Chinese films, that they would be censored or they would be blocked, or the directors would be censored or stopped from filming in the future. And it's been really since Xi Jinping came to power, but in particular, it was in the last 8 years that this level of censorship in China increased, and to a level that was driving people out of China who wanted to really make films, driving them to Taiwan and to other places because you just couldn't get past the censors in China. And these editors say that things have gotten a little bit better in the last year, but it's still a struggle and it's terrible. It's sad.
And since you've worked on documentary films in both China and Taiwan, I'm wondering if you could talk about the differences of working in China versus Taiwan.
Yeah, okay. Well, now you got me to tell this story. Why did the Chozuyu story resonate for me, particularly as just a white American woman who you wouldn't think has had to deal with this? But following President Obama's U.S. ambassador to China was always interesting. And I was working with one cinematographer, Mihaela Crosignani, who's actually from Uruguay. And the two of us I can't believe the two of us made this first film alone together in every which way, but we would get the call about suddenly the ambassador is going to Tibet. He's going to take this 25-hour train from Xining. You need to meet him there and then get your train tickets and go to Lhasa. And when that did happen, and through contacts, I had worked at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations before I worked at the council. And through contacts there, they helped me get an expedited visa for Tibet. You have to get a special permit to go to Tibet.
Okay.
And we got those, and we got the train tickets in advance, and we flew over completely jet lagged. We had this great filming in Xining on the Tibetan plateau. And then we boarded this train in the ambassador's train car, thinking that's where our tickets had us. And then we were told by authorities on the train after it had left the station that this was not the right train, that we were supposed to be on a different one, that it was all because they did not want us filming. They didn't want us filming the ambassador. They didn't want us filming in Tibet. So they made me and Mihaela stand by the bathrooms alone for hours and hours and hours.
Wow.
The meal time was called. The ambassador's team went first. They had their dinner. They went back. The entire rest of the train was called to dinner. They went back. Finally, they called me and Mihaela and said, okay, you can go into the dining car.
Wow.
All that was left was cold cabbage and tea. And again, these authorities, they must have been in China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, something, came up and yelled at me for making the mistake and yelled at me to go and grab the permits that we had and show them. So I went running back. They were threatening, most of the time, they were threatening to kick us off the train in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. It was very scary, actually. And then yelled at me, go grab your permit, go grab your passport. I go grab those. I come back. At this point, they're yelling so much at me. I'm crying. I'm asking, can I call my husband? And they're like, no. And they're yelling at me and I'm apologizing. And I'm just like profusely apologizing and crying and explaining how I had no idea. We didn't mean to get on this train, the wrong one. We were filming with the ambassador. We can put our cameras down. We're sorry we didn't do the right thing, whatever it was. And finally, after enough of that kind of bowing and scraping, they said, fine, basically go. You can sleep and stay if the ambassador's team can make room for you. And then I called my husband and I was still crying. He's like, where are you? I'm like, I don't know, but at least we're still on this train. So that was scary. And that was one of the reasons I knew the Chozuyu moment was a big deal.
Oh, but you weren't on the wrong train, were you?
You know what? I'm not sure because the ambassador's team actually checked our tickets before we even got on the bus with them to go to the train. And they were like, oh, yeah, you're just more like in steerage, but this is the train. So I'm not sure. I was so focused on being on the ambassador's train, and it was the only thing I had tried to book. I didn't think about, oh, sure, there could be other trains later that maybe they would, but they were just basically trying to scare us and intimidate us and stop us filming. And they succeeded in doing all those things. But generally, I would say it was night and day between access you can have to anyone in China's government and access to Taiwan's democracy and, presidential office building. When we were there that first year, there was this exhibit called Power to the People, and people were coming from everywhere and learning the story of Taiwan. I mean, it was beautiful. And it was so welcoming in Taiwan, where China, you always feel like you have to watch over your shoulder and someone's going to try to stab you in the back or not tell you what's really going on, or you better whisper and not speak the truth out in public, but behind closed doors. And it's really uncomfortable. And that's a diplomatic approach. That's the going for, following an ambassador. He's trying to say nice things about China to China. And it was still hard.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. I actually didn't want to get you to tell that story, so I'm glad. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, nice job.
You mentioned that there are a lot of scenes with Chinchu that had to be cut out. Are there any other scenes or things that were cut that you wish didn't have to be cut, and maybe they'll make it onto DVD or something later on?
Yes, I really appreciated when President Tsai shared how hard it was for her to be president because of her life suddenly being all in service of the people of Taiwan. It's her job. So she has a security detail. She's not allowed to drive herself. And driving was her passion and her pastime and her connection to her father and his business. And he had an auto mechanic repair shop, but she then allowed me to interview a lot of her friends and supporters, and all of them said how much President Tsai loved driving and loved to drive fast and loved to drive around the whole island of Taiwan. And then I've been thinking how interesting it might be to make a short where we connect that with that campaign commercial that President Tsai did with lighting the...
And Beacon.
Exactly. Driving the car and, the idea of good leadership and steady driving and teaching your passenger vice president how to take over the wheel, and be Kim in the back coming forward to the passenger seat as the VP. All of that metaphor of driving I thought worked really well. So that's something I would love to create as a short around this. But there's much more. There are funny scenes where, how Taiwan has these like mascots. There's like a mascot of Chunchu and a mascot of President Tsai and all these other big fuzzy colorful animals that came and did a dance on a stage in the backyard of President Tsai's residence when she was entertaining children. And that would be fun to get in. She went to an all-women's baseball game. She did an apology to the indigenous people, which is a whole other film somebody should do about the indigenous tribes of Taiwan, because that's deep. And complex. And it was something where we had to make a choice and say, there's too much complexity to this to just give it a beat in our movie. It wouldn't do it justice, but that would be a great supplement. We could at least start with a short, maybe encourage someone to make that feature if they're not already. Yeah, lots of good material that we look forward to sharing.
What would you say was the most challenging things or the obstacles that you ran into in making this film?
Unfortunately, the financing and support was a major obstacle. And I feel that has a lot to do with the state of the independent film and documentary business in the United States, but also fear of offending China being a major market, people not really knowing Taiwan's story and trusting that it deserved to be told, or not being interested in a first female president and the meaning and importance of Taiwan and its democracy in and of itself. And then really sadly, that started to change with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I wish it could have been different. But as I said, I do feel grateful to now be part of this wave of books and movies about Taiwan that were unthinkable 5 years ago. And we started 7 to 8 years ago.
Yeah.
So we were just ahead. And now it feels like it's a moment where more of these stories of Taiwan are being encouraged and I hope supported and will come out.
Yeah, because I heard in one of your interviews that you did have an early, like a U.S. financier, but that didn't work out.
Yes.
Yeah. So how have you been able to deal with that, like financing the film?
Well, we had to allow it to come out of our own pockets for a moment. We had to just keep applying for grants and donations and then hope that the tide shifted. And it did by the time, as I said, Russia invaded Ukraine. Then more people were willing to come in and support. They felt and understood the urgency of the story and the meaning of it and the timing of getting it out. Yeah.
With all the places that you've screened it so far, what is the most surprising feedback that you've gotten on the film so far?
Not surprising necessarily, but very moving was in Amsterdam with our international premiere at IDFA, the International Documentary Festival of Amsterdam. A Chinese couple came up to me and said that they were really inspired by the story of Taiwan and its democracy, and they wish that they had that in China. That was great. There was a woman who came up to me after a screening in the US who said, you know, I wasn't sure if I wanted to see the film because the poster was of President Tsai, and I don't know how I feel about her. But I am a scientist and I work in a lab with others who I've tried to explain Taiwan's story to before, and they'd never understand. And I can't get it across. And she was basically in tears saying, I'm so happy that the film was about so much more than President Tsai alone, that you covered this story of our history and democracy, because now I can show my friends and they will understand. And you really understood it in this way emotionally too, where I feel seen and heard. And that was great.
Interesting. What is it that you hope that people would take away from the film?
Really, that Taiwan matters and deserves to be seen and heard, as all people do, and deserves to have the future it wants to determine for itself. Self-determination, autonomy, peace, as the people of Taiwan want to define it, whatever they want to hold on to of their lifestyle, their democracy, their freedom. They should have. So how can the international community come together at this moment in time before an invasion or something terrible happens and build strength for Taiwan so that they have leverage with China? So, I mean, all of this would be over if China announced the use of force. If China just said, yes, I recognize that Taiwan exists, that Taiwan is its own country, its own democracy, and it deserves to be in the United Nations. It deserves to have what all other countries, including our own, have. That might be wishful thinking. So how do we get close to, you know, China knowing that it can't harm Taiwan without having serious repercussions, and also showing the world that trading more with Taiwan, engaging Taiwan, learning from Taiwan, and supporting it are all important.
And speaking of China, have you yourself gotten any negative feedback or any, you know, even worse, threats from pro-China media or parties?
Just a little bit so far. I have been warned to expect more of it, and I just hope it's not too frightening. But at the same time, I think that we can't continue self-censoring to save ourselves in that way, that maybe the real threat is for the people living in Taiwan on the front lines, with China firing missiles toward them and around them and flying too close in their air identification zone, all of that, that's what everyone should be concerned about. And, you know, sticking your neck out a little and having a little some Chinese threats here in the United States or anywhere else in the world is really not as serious. And we should just brave it so that we can support Taiwan.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share about Invisible Nation?
I feel you've done a fantastic interview. You've gone deep. I am grateful and thank you.
Yes.
We've got this theatrical release coming on May 31st, Friday night at the Quad in New York City. And in June on the 20th at the Laemmle Glendale in Los Angeles. And then moving on the 21st for a week-long run at the Laemmle Royal in LA. That's the beginning, and we'll just keep moving it around. But it's been very inspiring to be there for all of these screenings where audiences come up afterward, very moved and eager to bring the movie to a theater near them or a university or a think tank. And we're game for all of that. We're just on the road with this movie through the end of the year at least, and we are all in for it and Taiwan. So feel free to reach out to us and call on us to do what you need. We're here for you, here for Taiwan.
I did want to ask, I don't know if you're ready to think about this yet, but do you have any ideas for your future film projects, or are you working on something new? Have you thought about what your next project is?
Yes, I have started this next project, and it's another documentary, and it's looking at whether women can save democracy. That's the broadest possible tagline, but this time I'm looking at the United States because I think we're really in danger of losing our democracy in November. And I think, as I learned while making this film, there's way too little understanding of the meaning and importance of equality for women to democracy. And as I said, Taiwan is way ahead of the United States. The United States is way behind where most people think we are because we advertise ourselves like, we're a leading democratic country on the planet. But in fact, we're trending toward the Handmaid's Tale here with our treatment of women and the status of women, and that's unacceptable.
So how can people learn more about Invisible Nation or you and your work? What's the best way?
Oh, we're on a website called invisiblenation.net. And I'm at vhopeful on Instagram and Twitter.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Felicia.
I've been speaking with Vanessa Hope, director of the film Invisible Nation. To learn more about Vanessa, check out her Substack, A Question of Peace, at vanessahope.substack.com.
Now it's time for you to show us some love. Rate us on Spotify, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Audible, leave us a review there. It helps others to discover Talking Taiwan. To learn more about any of the items mentioned in this episode, visit our website, talkingtaiwan.com. There we'll list any related links. Thank you for listening to another episode of Talking Taiwan. I'm your host, Felicia Lin.
Talking Taiwan is brought to you by Forumosa.com.